Gruver here with us. Gary's worked with a lot of very, very large software teams, and he says he's got a contrarian take on a lot of things. And from a little bit what he's talking about, sounds like some experiences I've had as well. So I'm very excited about hearing what he's got to say related to dealing with large teams and maybe the things that look like they work well that don't, or maybe the common knowledge that gets passed out. So he's done a lot of work with HP and some other areas. So anyway, Gary, I'll turn it over to you. Very good to have you here, and thank you so much.
Great. Thanks for having me, Mark. Appreciate being here and appreciate everybody carving out some time in their day to think about how to do things differently. I've been an executive who led large organizations, 800 software developers, et cetera, and I probably got a very different view on what it takes to work and what it takes to be successful. And a lot of what I talk about is just trying to help other people be successful. And one of the key questions that tends to come out is, what's the role of executives in leading large software organizations? And more recently is, how can they leverage AI to influence improvements? The role as executives is not an easy question for a couple of reasons. First, software is different than anything else we manage. And second, it depends on all teams can work independently, or lots of teams need to work together to deliver business value. I think Jim Highsmith did us a great benefit when he documented the history of software development. And to understand why software development, this is a really good foundation to look at and go into. Jim did us a great service by documenting the software management approaches. And for many of us who have less than 60 years of history, it's hard to understand everything that was tried before Agile and the problems they were trying to address. Jim points out that they started by applying traditional management approaches to software. And while they did deliver large, complex things this way, the harder they worked to improve and become more predictable, the more frustrated they got. The problem that became obvious, as Kent Beck pointed out, is that because software is a complex, adaptive system, it needed a different approach. An approach that could address the complexities and take advantage of the flexible nature of software. They came out with these guiding principles that I'm sure everybody's seen more than once for this more adaptive approach. The focus was on making the development teams much more adaptive, using approaches for understanding how these complex systems were evolving so they understood how to adapt. And with proven success with small teams, they started to scale into larger organizations. The focus was on how to scale teams and not how the leaders should be taking a much more adaptive approach. The best guidance for executives was to empower the teams, remove roadblocks, and get out of the way. At HP, we took a very different approach to being more adaptive. We essentially did Agile upside down. Instead of focusing on the teams as leaders, we formed, for lack of a better team, a Scrum team. We were leading the rewrite of 10 million lines of code of the LaserJet firmware with 400 to 800 developers. It was a very large, complex, adaptive system that we were trying to optimize to deliver as much business value as possible. We were constantly trying to understand how the system was evolving and how we needed to influence priorities to optimize the end outcomes. And over a 4-year period, we delivered 2 to 3x improvements in productivity, while we were letting the teams work in whatever method they chose. What we realized looking back is that while some teams chose to implement Agile practices, some didn't. We didn't see dramatic differences in results based on how they chose to work. While as an organization, we delivered breakthrough improvements. This led us to the conclusion that in a large, tightly coupled system, the first order effect is the leadership team actively engaging with an adaptive approach. The second order effect is how the teams work. This isn't to say stop doing all the things you're doing at the team level. It's more to say if you want to deliver breakthrough results, you're going to need deeper engagement and influence by the leadership team. After thinking about this for years, I believe the reasons it's so important that the leaders play an active role is because they're uniquely positioned to influence changes that have the biggest impact. They're closer to the business, so they better understand the strategic objectives of the applications and constraints of the business. They're better positioned to be able to look across teams, which is where some of the biggest opportunities for improvements exist in large organizations. And they're better positioned to influence change. Since this recommendation is very different from anything you're hearing in the industry, I'm going to start with an example of a large transformation I led at HP. The example is not intended to tell you to do what we did, but more to show the types of improvements and the impact of changes best influenced by leaders. Then I'll review an active role for leadership, including some basic common sense principles that can be leveraged to address your unique situations. And finally, I'll show you how and why leaders should be leveraging AI to accelerate improvements. In 2007, I got an opportunity to take over leading HP's enterprise LaserJet firmware team. This team had been the bottleneck for the business for over 2 decades. We couldn't add a new printer to our plans or new features without checking with firmware, and usually the answer was no. The firmware supported lots of new and existing products with different versions of the code base on different branches. It created lots of problems. This was frustrating but tolerable until we started getting into copiers. HP was investing in a new high-end copier, and it needed no excuses solution from firmware. This required us to integrate seamlessly into Microsoft's Active Directory system for things like scan to secure email. The leader before me had tried an initial release and determined this would require developing our code on their XP embedded platform for seamless integration, because they were making changes and we just couldn't keep up and follow the changes if we're on their platform that got integrated together. So they convinced the organization that this would require a complete rewrite of the code base, and then promptly found another job. When I got the job, they weren't looking for someone to create the plan. They were looking for a leader that could make it happen. The objectives were clear. It was a complete rewrite on XPE of 10 million lines of code. It needed to have all the features of the existing code base or it wouldn't be accepted by our customers. And it needed to be done in time for the new copier release. We didn't have a lot of flexibility on this front, so it was a bit of a challenge. At this point, the traditional approach for this organization would be to go into months-long planning session to show it couldn't be done without more resources. And then a few more months going back and forth with the organization to see what we could get. The new leadership had seen this play out in the past and didn't want to do it again because it knew it wouldn't get additional resources. Instead, we focused in on making it happen with the resources we had. We wrote down a list of the most important things we felt we needed to get done that month and started working. It was kind of before Agile had gotten to the enterprise, but it was kind of an iteration. And when you had 800 people, getting them aligned and going in the same direction, a month seemed more realistic to sort of get everybody aligned and committed to what they are. And that was a much more adaptive approach, where before we would have created a plan and measured ourselves on how well we achieved the plan. And so we got into this adaptive approach, and I just don't see that happening from the team up for an organization. At the end of that month and every other month, we reviewed what we got done and developed plans for the next month. We focused on reviewing working code and understanding how the complex system was coming together, so we knew what to prioritize next. It was a fundamentally different approach that was much more about learning and adapting as a leadership team. We realized while the charter was for XPE for the copier, the code base also needed to scale to Windows CE to be a viable, cost-effective option for printers. We needed to get away from all the complex branching and develop all the products on a common trunk. We also needed to increase our investments in test automation. These were things asked for by upper management. These weren't things asked for by upper management. These are things I can't imagine being driven by teams. But as the leaders of the organization, we realized we needed to influence these strategic perspectives if we were going to be successful. The next piece, as leaders, we also spent a lot of time looking across all the teams to identify the biggest sources of inefficiencies. We realized that instead of working to an architectural plan for later integration, we should be putting together thin slices of the architecture across teams to ensure it would work. So we started working on the simplest things we could do and tried to plug the architecture together end to end to make sure it could work. And we learned and evolved and we adjusted based on what the working code was doing, not coming together to realize an architectural plan. We realized when trunk became unstable and it impacted the productivity of all the developers, so we started putting in place quality gates that the code had to pass through before making it to trunk. We invested in a common test framework and we drove a lot of investments in 2.0 when we realized our version 1.0 was creating flaky tests that were wasting a lot of time. Now we had to slow down to do these things and we had to divert resources to make them happen. But as we were watching this complex system come together, we were realizing these were the types of things that were slowing down the organization and we needed to slow down to go fast. And we're constantly spending time out in the organization trying to understand how a complex system was coming together, what was getting in the way, why things were breaking, what was happening, so we could improve the effectiveness of the organization and help influence priorities. We were constantly learning and adapting. With any big changes like this, there's also going to be resistance. Most of the developers in the group had been doing things the same way for decades and were part of the team that had been the bottleneck for a couple of decades. What we had changed was the leader and about half the leadership team. Getting developers to embrace new ways of working required a lot of influence by this team. The adaptive approach was completely new and just couldn't have happened from the bottom up, right? Is the bottom up going to interact with how you do the business and say we don't have this plan that we're tracking, or more this is how we're learning and evolving? I just don't see that happening at the team level. We also changed the way we use metrics. Instead of measuring the teams to their plans, to sort of say, are we measuring how accurate your plans are? We use the metrics to understand how the complex system was evolving and understanding the changes that would help the organization become more effective. We also realized several times, like with the common test framework, we need to slow down for a period of time and get the foundations right so we can speed up later. Probably the biggest change management challenge we had was getting people to embrace a common trunk. They'd been doing things the same way for so long, they just couldn't wrap their minds around how this could work. And if we hadn't been so persistent as a leadership team, I don't think this would have ever happened, and our cost structure and our complexities of our system would have been very different. There are a lot of other changes that required the influence of the leadership team kind of pushing to people to embrace new ways of working. But these are some of the ones that had the biggest impact on the organizations, and they're types of changes leaders are uniquely positioned to influence. By the time we completed the rewrite, we were doing things we never thought possible. We were bringing in 75 to 100,000 lines of code turmoil with defect fixes and new features every day, while keeping 10,000 hours of testing on racks of servers passing at 90%. If you would have told any of the leaders in the beginning this was possible, they would have told you were crazy. So how do you develop a plan for something you don't think is possible? You don't. Instead, it takes a constant focus, influence priorities, and discovering with the team what's possible, or an adaptive leadership approach. Hopefully this example has helped you appreciate the power of having a much more engaged leadership team. If you have a large organization developing lots of small independent applications, or large applications that have been architected to enable teams to work independently, then empowering the teams and removing the roadblocks is the right approach. For all other big complex systems, you're going to need an aligned adaptive leadership team to ensure the complex adaptive system is evolving to best meet the needs of business. A team that's willing to learn and adjust as the system is evolving. And this is very different than you're going to hear anywhere else. It starts with the vision and objective. That's what drove everything we were doing, and if it weren't for that focus, I don't think we would have ever accomplished the breakthroughs we did. We weren't trying to be the best Agile shop. We weren't trying to be the best DevOps shop. We weren't trying to do any of those things. We wanted to no longer be the bottleneck for the business and free up capacity for innovation, and that's what drove everything that we did. The next step is that the team needs to have a common understanding of how the process works today, because software, unlike manufacturing, is so hard to see and understand. Everyone has a unique perspective given their role. Therefore, we need to take the time to make the current process visible so we have a common understanding of the issues that are slowing you down. Next, when we start influencing improvements, we need to understand that the hardest thing is overcoming resistance to change. One of the things I've found helpful is moving past industry buzzwords to common sense principles. When I use words like Agile, DevOps, TDD, BDD, etc., whatever you want to throw in there, I have found that people have preconceived notions of what they mean and pre-prepared arguments for why they won't work there. Instead, I've moved to using common sense principles that are harder to refute, easier to adapt to your unique challenges. The goal is to provide leadership with some very basic principles for talking about all the different types of improvements that might make sense for their organizations. And I tend to start with these very basic common principles. What do you develop? What's your architecture? How do you improve the creative part of software development? How to improve repetitive tasks? And how do you optimize flow? Let's start with what to develop. Because software is such a complex system, it can be hard to predict how the customers will use it and what changes will deliver the desired business value. Not every idea we have is going to work. The key to removing waste in this part of the process is getting feedback from as close to the customer as possible, so we can adjust and modify approaches to deliver the desired outcome. Second, because the complexity of software, developer leaders frequently don't have a good understanding of the capacity of the organization, so they end up creating plans that overwhelm the development teams and disappoint the business. When developer organizations are overcommitted, it leads to burnout, waste, and the buildup of technical debt. And when organizations don't deliver what the business expects, they start to lose confidence. The key to removing waste from this part of the process requires leaders to better understand the capacity of the organization to ensure they aren't overcommitted and can meet the basic business deliverable, while ensuring there's always a backlog of work for developers so they have something ready if they finish early. The third challenges organizations can have is they end up with a requirements process that, because it's so much easier to create ideas than it is to implement them, organizations tend to end up with a backlog of requirements that start taking on a life of their own. The more requirements organizations have in the backlog, the more managing the list, creating detailed definitions take away from delivering values to customers. Removing waste in this area requires leaders to limit the work invested in requirements until it's required to support either a business decision or developers to get ready to get started on work. Next, as the HP example of the architecture for a common trunk showed, the architectural approach can dramatically impact the efficiencies of the development processes and the value of the product. The current or planned architecture can either be a constraint or enabler. Left to the architecture, it will probably work, but might not be optimized to deliver as much business value as possible. Gaining a common understanding requires not just an architectural map, but visibility in the implications of the architecture on the product and the development process. Does it require lots of different teams working together closely? Are there clean interfaces where it's easy to test separate components? Is it tightly coupled to the hardware, which makes it difficult to leverage capacity in the cloud? Is the architecture inhibiting or enabling what the business needs? Once you have a good understanding of the constraints in the current architecture, you need to decide if the impact on the business warrants the risk associated with architectural changes. At HP, I didn't have a choice. The job was to rewrite 10 million lines of code from the ground up, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done. It put the business at risk because we couldn't ship another product till it was complete, and it set the development team up for a death march. Sometimes a complete rewrite is required to meet the business needs, and maybe it was true this time. But if possible, I would avoid that situation at all costs. If the current architecture puts unacceptable constraints on the business, is it possible to take an evolutionary approach to improving it by leveraging approaches developed by Martin Fowler? If it is, I'd strongly recommend that approach. The next basic principle is around improving creative work writing software. Shifting to building in quality makes a big difference here. Manufacturing learned a long time ago that the only way to be successful is to focus on quality. They did this by controlling the process, because the process was creating the same product repeatedly. Software is different, and then it involves a person working with the business to create new and different solutions each time. Instead of controlling the process, we need to work on giving that person the best possible feedback on the intended and unintended consequences of their changes and how those work with the rest of the system. The quicker we can provide that feedback, the more help it is to the developer in terms of improving and limiting waste associated with work going down the wrong path. The can be made visible by mapping the feedback delay. Like you can see the deployment pipeline mapped here, you can see where the defects are found, and you can see the delay in the feedback. And if I give you feedback, Mark, on something that you worked on 6 weeks ago, is it going to be valuable and helpful? As opposed to, I can tell you that at 10 o'clock this morning you and Elisa checked in something and one of you broke things and you need to figure out how to fix it. So that's kind of a different approach. And there's also a lot of opportunities right now that are really coming on with AI to help developers become more productive during the creative process of writing code. It's all about learning what can be done to help developers in becoming more effective and productive. And it's really interesting to see the changes in responses. I talk to developers that I've worked with for years. When they first started using some of the tools, they're like, it's kind of a waste, it's not there. I checked with them 2 months later, it's like, wow, this is really working pretty good. And then when I checked with them 2 months later again, they're like, yeah, the productivity gains are so large, even a very cheap constrained organization, they're buying licenses for everybody because they're seeing the dramatic improvements it can provide. The other thing with software is there's a lot of repetitive tasks that can be automated to reduce costs and ensure consistency. Then, like any process, they can be continually improved over time, which is especially important for things like testability. The automation provides several benefits. First, it reduces the cost of manually doing the same thing repeatedly. Second, it provides consistencies that keeps developers from being distracted by problems not associated with their code changes. And third, it enables working in small batch sizes that are much easier to debug and triage. And when we started, a lot of these things fall under DevOps, but if you say that word, you're probably going to get resistance and pushback about why it doesn't work. But can you start by saying, well, should we automate the creation of environments so we can do it consistently and repeatably? Can we do the same when we build our software, deploy our software, and test our software? All these things are logical things that make sense if you take them back to the common sense principles and try not to use the industry buzzwords that bring up resistance and bring up different people's hackles and get things shut down before they need to be. We can also look at removing waste and becoming more efficient with each of these types of work we've described so far. There's also opportunities to look across the entire system to identify opportunities for improvements. For optimizing the overall system, it makes sense to leverage Goldratt's theory of constraints from manufacturing. He taught us to optimize the flow to the customer. We need to understand the source of the bottleneck, make sure it's never started for work, and do everything we can to optimize its flow and limit the work in process. For software, the bottleneck can be in requirements, the development or release possible. It's possible, but it doesn't happen very often. The requirements process, because it's much easier to come up with ideas than it is to implement. It's usually either release or development, and the first step to improving flow is gaining a common understanding of the bottleneck. The bottlenecks in the release process, we should look at automating the repetitive task and working in smaller batch sizes and release more often. If it's with the developers where we want it, since that's where the value is being created, we want to do everything we can to help make them more productive. So given all this, we got the basic common sense principles. How can AI help leaders? As somebody's been helping leaders for over a decade to influence improvements, when AI came on the scene, my focus has been on how can it help accelerate those processes. It first started showing potential for helping create automated tests, which is typically one of the slowest processes for most transformations. But how do you use AI with your code base without risking your IP? Do you give your coders access to something like GitHub Copilot that helps them while they're writing their code? Yeah, you should be doing anything possible to help your developers become more productive because they're likely your current bottleneck. But does it help leaders understand the basic principles we've been discussing? No, not really. So I've been studying that and looking at it and trying to figure out how to do it. And you don't just want to go off and ask ChatGPT questions because you really want to be asking questions about your code base and how does it work. Can you put your code base into question using RAG and use RAG to insert the prompt and have your code base go in and ask questions about that? Maybe, but that has limitations on the amount of data that can be inserted as part of the prompt. As IP risk, and how do I afford to run these large language models to help improve software in large organizations? These are the questions I've been wrestling with as I've been researching AI. And to be honest, I've been disappointed in what I've been finding until I saw a demo from one of my clients the other day that just fundamentally blew my mind. Instead of using RAG or taking it out and exposing their IP risk, they were able to bring AI agents, so smaller large language components into their system. They had one that could do Java, they had one that could do C Sharp, they had one that could do C++, and they had a coordinating agent. And they brought all of those into their data source that had their GitHub repository. And so these weren't exposed outside, they were sitting inside their data center and they had a prompt and they started asking it questions. I was like, okay, so if you look at the basic principles we had, one of the first questions I had is, analyze my GitHub repository. Can you create an XML architectural drawing of the code base describing the function of each major component? The first thing they tried using it was to understand the architecture. And this isn't the actual response. This is my hack to try and getting the simple concept across without revealing Exabeam's IP. But they were able to generate a complete architectural drawing of the code base with descriptions in 3 minutes. Not what the architects think it is or how the leaders understand it, but what the code base actually does. Can you imagine how helpful this would have been when you were migrating to the cloud and only found out during implementation how many calls were directly tied to the hardware? Can you imagine the other questions you would like to ask your code base? Like, can you show me all the codes going around that API and recommend code changes that would help achieve the architectural intent? Keep in mind that these AI solutions are early, so we need to have humans in the loop. But having AI find and recommend architectural improvements is going to enable this to go much faster, even if it's going to take a few iterations with AI before it's creating code your technical leads will accept. Can you tell me the automated test code coverage for each API? Can you provide me an example of an automated test that would improve the code coverage for API number 1? Once that approach is reviewed and found acceptable, can you increase the code coverage to X% based on the improved design pattern? Can you write Gherkin code for each automated test so everyone understands in plain English exactly what each component is doing? Can you imagine how valuable this would be for modernizing old applications where most of the experts are retiring? So you're not sure what everything does? Can you see how valuable this would be to getting the AI to answer questions about the code base would be for leaders? I can, and to be honest, it's blowing my mind. I've been doing work in large organizations on this stuff since 2007, and this used to be a hard, slow process. I'm starting to realize it doesn't have to be anymore, and I'm starting to imagine a world where software is no longer a bottleneck. This is a view I usually create with organizations. The leader have a common understanding of their development process and delivery process works. It typically takes people a couple of months to create an approximation. I'm not sure this is possible with the Exabeam demo because it would require not just the Git repository, but the defect tracking tool and probably your deployment tools. But imagine somebody could figure it out and put all those in a common data place that you can put your AI agents on top of. And these are smaller AI agents that you can afford to run and fit in your data center. And it's some I think the leaders would find extremely valuable. Once this is in place, I'd love to ask questions like, can you show me the automated tests that failed in build number 314 of the quality gate for subsystem 1? Can you recommend a fix to either the code or the test as appropriate for me to review? For any defects found at UAT, can you create an automated test that could be run in the subsystem quality gate to find the issue early? Can you think of other questions you'd like to ask your deployment pipeline? I can, and to me it's fascinating. And I ask these questions to organizations. I've been working with them for over a decade. The speed with which they can answer these questions is very slow. One of the other things I usually ask is branching, because it creates duplicate work in the system. I really focus in on organizations and understanding, where do you have branching, how do you have branching, how does it work? Exabeam hadn't done this yet, but when I send them the question and ask to create branching answers, I got this answer back 13 minutes later. I tracked my email. Part of it was probably David's time to get the email and respond to it and find time to work on it. But within 13 minutes, he provided this back to me. And I was shocked. Being able to understand branching and everything, and the specifically of the responses, right? On some days, especially April 7th, there were up to 17 PRs merged in the branch, causing lots of integration issues. When was a leader able to understand that real time quickly when they're looking into their branching? And it comes back with very specific recommendations. You can choose to do some of them, you cannot choose to do all of them, but being able to do that and 17 years working on these problems, the speed and the ability to understand what's going on in my code base and how I do development, it is fundamentally blowing my mind away. And I can't encourage leaders strongly enough to start taking this adaptive approach and start leveraging AI and find a way to interrogate their code base and start asking and responding to these types of questions. So how do you get started? The key to starting is getting the leadership to engage with the organization to help influence how the complex adaptive system is evolving to deliver as much business value as possible. They need to be clear about what they want to accomplish and have a common understanding of the current process. They need to set up an AI agent system that can help them make the process visible, provide recommendations, and start making improvements. Then they need to agree on the improvements they feel will best address their unique challenges. Hopefully, some of these common sense principles and AI approach will make that easier. And finally, to help overcome resistance to change, I recommend working in small reversible steps, one iteration at a time. And this enables the team to learn and adjust as they start making changes. With this approach, the team can stay aligned as they work one iteration at a time. It's less important where they start, since they will have the ability to adjust and take advantage of the adaptable nature of software. And if we let them pick where they want to start, they're much less likely to be resistant to change. So I've showed examples of what leaderships can do if they're actively engaged. I've provided some very basic principles, common sense principles that I think are much easier to get past organizations because you don't have people sort of, so we tried that, it won't work here, I got all these excuses. I encourage you to not push a agile approach or a DevOps, or let's talk to leaders in common sense approach and get them to articulate what they're trying to do with the business. And then, you know, get going, start learning, start adjusting. I appreciate your time. I've got, you know, probably 20 minutes plus for questions. Um, the leadership role is on that link with the bit.ly for software executives. I was trying to write down what I thought leaders should know about leading a large software organization as simple as possible. I wrote this paper before the AI presentation. Um, I understand that books are too long for executives to read, so I was trying to make it as short as I possibly could. And my goal was to raise the gold rush challenge. If you don't understand a problem well enough, you can't explain it simply. My plan was to turn this into a book, but my focus on clarity got it down to 18 pages, which I think fits with the constraints of the busy executives, but missed the marketing target as a book. I chose to stick with meeting the needs of the reader, and I would have written less, but I ran out of time. There are other papers on my resource tab of my website you might also find helpful. Um, the link to my book on Gumroad there is there. I think Mark's going to paste that in there along with the code to get a 40% discount, that you can do that. I've turned that fourth book into a computer-based training because a lot of times it's hard to get people to read books. And so what I found out works better is if it's a computer-based training, it's a shorter content than the books, but it's also got a lot of knowledge checks and actually scenarios that you've got to play out and answer the questions correctly to analyze sources of waste in your organization and make them visible. And I found people get more value out of that. And plus, it's something you can put in an organization, have everybody take the training, and then you have a common way for looking at things and seeing things. My email is gary@garygruver.com. If you want to try the training or look at that, or get a discount on that, send me an email and let me know. GaryGruver.com's got a lot of resources and help. And I'm close to retirement. My passion now is really trying to help as many people as I can. So with that, I'm sure this is a very contrary view, and you've probably brought up a lot of, well, that's different than anything I heard. I want to hear a lot of questions. So let's start the debate.
Well, Gary, that's great. I've got a few people have posted questions. If there's something you'd like to ask, I'm putting the link here for the Slido. Feel free to throw it in there. Chris Collins was asking if you were to lead this today, and I think this was back when you were talking about the HP thing, what would you do differently? Like if you found yourself back in that position again today, what would you do differently?
I would take an evolutionary approach to re-architecture instead of a complete rewrite.
Okay.
I probably wouldn't do it on XPE or CE, but both of those cost money. But at the time, Active Directory was changing a lot and moving a lot, and we just couldn't hire the resources to make it go. The fundamental common sense principles that you go after are the same. How you go after them is different. And I don't know. We were making things happen so fast compared to what people were doing in the past. The guy who didn't get the job really wanted to try to be co-managing it with me because he was in technical support. And if I would have told him we were bringing in that many lines of code turmoil right before release, I think he would have had a heart attack and keeled over it. It was the thing I would do the same as the fundamentals of learning, adjusting, and trying to take an adaptive approach and trying to really spend all your time with the metrics using to understand how the complex system is evolving so you know how to influence the priorities for the next iteration.
So, with the idea of the thing you said you do different is trying to take more of an iterative approach. So, how would you go about selling that? Because I'll raise some objections that you'd likely hear is saying, well, if we do it iteratively, then we'll have to rewrite lots of code. How would you go ahead and approach that? Saying, no, this is here's why we want to do this, even though we may have to type more letters or whatever.
Well, but if you showed what the AI agent's able to do and that sort of stuff, I think you can make the current architecture very, very visible.
Okay.
and start using AI to sort of recommend those architectural changes. If you can put those agents right on top of your code base
Hmm.
and jump down on that, I think it's a fundamentally different approach.
So what you're saying, if I understand what you're saying, then is that the visibility that you see AI can give you into your code base can make it easier to make iterative changes rather than saying we're going to replace all million lines of code. Is that, am I
Yes,
understanding that right? Okay.
and it can start recommending code snippets, and you can do iterations on the code snippets until you have stuff that your architectures are approving and liking and making work. So
Okay. Cool.
yeah.
Let's see. Demetrius asked, it sounds like you may have been the champion or change agent. You were also in leadership role in the organizations. Do you think your role had influence on your team in embracing the openness for change? How did you get the other leaders that you may how did you get the other leaders that you may have been dependent on to buy into your approach?
That was hard. Like there were people outside my organization that um, pushed back against that and didn't think that that was the best approach. But to be honest, I was heads down executing, and I was a leader of 800 people, and I had a staff, and we were learning and adjusting, and I had to go to different. I really didn't push on them to tell them I was taking a fundamentally different approach. I just did it. I didn't ask permission. I just went and made it happen. And looking back on it, if they had known that we didn't have a detailed plan for 4 years out that we were executing to, they probably would have freaked out. I mainly just didn't really tell them. I just went and did it.
Okay, so the ask for forgiveness instead of permission approach. That's I'll note that. Okay. Uh, Stephanie was asking, can you talk a little bit about what it took to get the agents accepted and in place? So I think we're talking, Stephanie, feel free to speak up if I'm misrepresenting this or if you want to clarify, but I think she's talking about um, just getting the organization to accept letting you even run this stuff against your code base.
Oh, so this is, and I was looking down through the chat to see if David Rizzo joined us. He's at Exabeam, and I've been working with Exabeam with my standard process, and let's make it visible and let's do monthly iterations. And I set them up and did a workshop with them and agreed on where to get started. And then every month I do a monthly call with them. And for 2 years I've been like, you guys looking at AI? You guys looking at AI? You guys looking at AI? And they, this was the most legacy part of their code base. And they got new stuff, and they've merged with other companies and did different stuff, this on-prem stuff. And they finally came back and gave me this demo, and I don't know how they got permission. If David's online, you can maybe comment in. But the idea here was, these are agents that they don't have access outside your data center, so they can't be exposing your IP. These are very small large language models, if that makes sense as a term at all. But they're small, they're affordable to run, but they're very focused on specific tasks. Like they had one for all the different types of code that they had in their code base. They had an agent that was leveraged from that. And I think they just got them off of Amazon Web Services, but they kept them within this tightly constrained thing so they didn't have the AP going out, or the IP going out.
So Stephanie, did that help? Did you have any follow-up questions on that?
Um, I suppose not really. It sounds like a lot of negotiation maybe and soothing fears and keeping controls in place for the risk management. I'm just thinking getting an organization to accept those agents inside so that you can ask. The power of the prompting and the querying and being able to check on the database, of course, makes, your code base makes a lot of sense, but getting people to accept it and do it and move past the fear stage, I think that's just it's a pretty big bump in my mind.
But to me, these are not things that you're sending your IP outside of your organization. You're not sending anything outside your firewall. You're bringing an agent by itself inside of your firewall to sit within your constraint. So that's where, to me, the risk just fundamentally got much, much lower and very different than what I typically would have seen in the past.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Getting it inside the firewall and everything. Yeah. I guess there's just, I'm still fairly new in using AI myself to ask some of the queries and prompts. And now I'm curious about how you get the, since you brought very tightly controlled bits of AI and certain agents in, how do you get this AI agents to talk to each other and get more of the knowledge? Some of the questions you were asking, you know, how do you do your code coverage for, or what's the extent of your code coverage on this particular thing? Now, how do you grow that across C++ and the C# and the next version, the next, you know, or for old databases that have, or old code bases that have lots of mixed technologies in them, you got to get all those agents working together after you manage to get them all in. So it's, you know, the questions you're asking are very logical and things I've gotten dozens and dozens of times. And the answer is go put a human on that problem because it's too complicated.
Well, in that branching map, when I ask that of an organization, that will typically take them up to a month to collect it and put it in a visible way. That's seeing that in 13 minutes, and the 13 minutes including the time that it took somebody to see the email and sort of write the prompt and put it in and send the email back, boggled my mind. And I'm not sure if David Rizzo's on or if he can speak up or if David Kennedy's here, but I think I pushed on them to use AI forever, and I think they were using Amazon Web Services as their platform, and I think Amazon Web Services approached them with this approach and came up with these. I think there's a lot of other agents that you could get off of huggingface.com or a bunch of different other places, but this is what they did and how they did it, and this is going to evolve quickly, but this is such a valuable tool for leaders to really understand what's going on in their code base and how to improve and how to drive it. I can't imagine why you wouldn't be doing it. And it looks, and I think these are smaller, less resource intensive agents that do specific tasks that can do these types of things.
So Jess had an interesting question, like the AWS agents you're talking about, is this running in the cloud or is this running somewhere on
I'm not sure if they have their Git repository in their own isolated cloud that they're doing it, or if they've got on-prem that they're bringing it into that. But in either way, they felt their IP was not at risk because it was within their IT domain that had firewalls around it that didn't enable the leaking of the IP.
And Stephanie,
and I said Amazon Web Services because that's what they use. But if you go out to huggingface.com and you search for the different types of, you know, agents, maybe you have Golang and you don't have C#, maybe you have something else, you know, whatever your language of choice happens to be.
and do you think there might be something like a similar adoption curve to, like, for a long time, everybody's really scared about putting stuff in the cloud. Like, you don't want to do that. We got to keep it all on-prem. And it seems like there might be a similar curve to using AI on your data once you've seen enough other people do it and have the knowledge and understanding of why this is separate than something that's just sending your data out to the cloud. Is that likely to happen?
Yeah, but you know, there are other things you can do with, if you go out to Hugging Face, you can download these AI agents and put them on in your data center in your place.
Okay.
It may take a while to find the agents that's going to work best for you, or how to make sure that those work correctly. But bringing those into your data center, there's a bunch of people doing a lot of work in that, and I'm not the expert in that. But to be running large organizations and not be experimenting with these things to try to answer these types of questions to help accelerate your transformations seems irresponsible.
Demetrius said he wasn't able to get the AgileLnL discount code to work. I guess he tried to buy
I haven't started it yet.
Okay.
I was going to wait till after that. You gave me the code. Give me about an hour after we're done, and I'll
Okay.
try to get that up and running.
Okay, hang in there, Demetrius. Another question, can you describe more the LLMs used for AI agents, including both coordinating agents and programming language? think it sounds like that's more specific than what you were actually experiencing on this.
I'm an executive of a large leader of an organization. I'm not a programmer. Just to be clear, I'm a mechanical engineer that leads large software organizations and has learned a lot from them and doing it. But you don't want me writing code, and you don't want me in those details.
So somebody else asked, how do you deal with the AI hallucinations and limitations of AI? So like, is that anything you ran into?
I think the human in the loop,
Okay.
right? You're going to ask those questions, and you're going to say, you know, create the architecture diagram and all that. Show me the thing. Show me an example. And you're not going to just sort of say write it all and do it all. You're going to iterate through until you're getting answers that work for you and are successful.
Well, probably the similar thing with the asking humans to do it, and it takes a month to get information back. You're still going to look at it and say, "Does this make sense?" You just do it in 13 minutes instead of an entire month, right?
Right. And you get the specific details about what your code base is doing, not a high level overview that, you know, when you had the discussion with the architects, you were all ready to move to the cloud. And then when you started doing it, you really didn't, you found out there were tighter links in there that existed that you weren't aware of, that the architects weren't telling you about, and maybe didn't know, right? You got 10 million lines of code. How in the world do you know what that whole thing is doing and have the ability to process it and analyze it versus, you know, what AI could do for you?
So another question was, improving code architecture, et cetera, is great. Can you give a few examples of how you measured that your improvement was actually increasing value delivered to the customers and end users?
You know, part of it was gut feel. Part of it was, can teams work more independently? Can you bring code together and release more frequently? At the architectural improvements is not the goal. No longer being the bottleneck for the organization and freeing up capacity for innovation is the goal, and that's what we measured, and that's what we tracked, and that's what we focused on. And you know, if the hard part is making the architecture visible, and between the architectural diagrams and these deployment pipelines, this is where you show how the two interact and play together, because your architecture defines your development process.
Mm-hmm.
Like I say, if you got it architected to where small teams can independently work and develop and deliver code, you don't need leaders actively doing this. They can empower the teams getting out of the way. But I see architectures that are tightly coupled more than not. And as you're trying to explain it to people what you're changing and why you're changing, I think you need to describe not just what the architecture is and what it could be, but what the implication is on the development process and how changing it can fundamentally make you better, make things work better.
I really like the thing you said about the goal being to make sure that we're no longer the constraint on the overall system. Like, you know, we're not being the bottleneck anymore. I really like that as a goal because it's something that you probably can measure, and it's very, very meaningful, because if the constraint is somewhere else, you've done what you need to do for now until the constraint moves back to you.
And that forever I've been sort of software developers and bottleneck, and people are looking at AI and it's like, oh, it's going to put all the software developers out of work and all this. And I'm looking at it going, there are so many ideas to do with software that we can't get done because software has been the bottleneck for so long. I'm starting to imagine a world where software is not the bottleneck.
Wow.
And can you imagine the types of things that could happen?
Okay, that's going to get me thinking for a long time. That's a very good question. Another question: when it comes to asking AI to write test code for an existing API, are you seeing results where those are producing valuable tests with less effort than a human doing it on their own? Is that what you're seeing, or okay?
Yes.
So not just a future state that you think this will happen. You're seeing that today.
Yes, with these agents, they're doing that, and they're doing and start small, right? Can you show me? Can you write a test that you think would improve my code coverage at this quality gate? And human in the loop, right? Review it, feedback. Yeah, that was close, but God, could you make it do this or make it do that? And the one that blew me away from the demo is when they were asking the question is like, wow, this test failed at this quality gate on this build. Can you tell me whether you think it was a code problem or a test problem and recommend an improvement? Exabeam was doing that and getting those answers and recommended
Oh.
code back.
Wow.
It may not be right, it may not be perfect, but it's a whole lot better than starting with the debug log.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Okay, well, that's the questions in the Q&A. Does anyone have any other questions for Gary? We've got a few more minutes here. And Gary, this has been great. I really enjoyed this. This is very, very interesting. A few more seconds.
How about you, Mark? You got anything? Debate?
Oh, well, one of those questions was one that I had for you on if you're actually seeing improvements today. But I think a lot of your experience has matched mine, that and to kind of, and this may be kind of my take on me hearing what you're saying, but that a lot of times we go in and we're trying to be agile, and so we do all the opposite of what agile is actually saying because we use the word or DevOps or whatever. And so you've got to make sure you're doing fundamentally what's actually benefiting you, even if you have to not use the word, because otherwise people do all kinds of crazy things.
Yeah. If anybody that knew DevOps or Agile or TDD or any of those things watched the presentation, you would see how you could put the types of things that you do into those common sense principles. And it's not a hard fit, but I never use those words because I don't want to have the resistance.
Okay, so this is a question for, why is there resistance? Where does that resistance come from?
Oh God, I tried that before. We did the Agile at the old place, and it totally screwed up my business. Okay. It just didn't work. We had these consultants coming in telling us we had to stand up in meetings instead of sitting down, and it didn't get any better. And we focused everything on how to do Agile, not being more adaptive and responsive.
Okay.
And we were focused on the business of Agile versus the principles of Agile that Jim Highsmith and others tried to lay out.
Okay. So it's a situation where everybody has experience being sold Agile as a product. And so the idea of actually achieving agility makes them think of that. So don't talk to them about agility. Let them, that's just
or DevOps. The other thing is start with small reversible steps, one iteration at a time. Because there's a really good book called The Catalyst by I'm trying to remember it, but there's a white paper out on my thing about organizational change management, and look at that, because if you're trying to influence these changes in organizations, you are by definition a change agent.
Okay. Cool. This is great stuff. Well, Gary, thank you so much for coming. I really, really appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time to share with us. This was great. Yeah. And I think I know I saw a lot of things here, either from an angle I hadn't seen it before or just new stuff. And you're making me think a lot deeper about some things that I had maybe, particularly with AI, things with AI that I was kind of like, yeah, I don't see how useful that'd be. But I think you showed me some aspects to it that I can really see a lot of value in. So I'm excited about it. Hopefully it's helpful for everyone else. Thank you so much for coming. Oh, just to let everybody know, we've got some guests. You may have an invite for tomorrow at 4 a.m. So I had some people in Australia that really wanted to come to these, so I'm going to get up at 4 a.m. Please do not feel compelled to wake up at 4 a.m. to join me. We'll probably do that one again later. If you happen to be up and want to join, that's great. But that's mostly being done for people on the other side of the world where the sun is shining when it's not shining here. So that the time is correct. It's just a weird time because of that. So hope to see some of you next week. Next few weeks, we've got some interesting speakers coming up. And yeah, thank you everybody for coming. And Gary, thank you again. Really appreciate it.
Okay, and if the people from Australia have questions, my email address is out there.
Okay, sounds good. So